being here. We've got some things that we want to make public, kind of a culmination of our work over the last 6 months of the Fentanyl Working Group. But before we dive into that, I want to turn to the Select Committee Chairman Molinard for just a couple of comments.
Well, I would just like to say, I know Representative Johnson would like to say a few words too, and how much we've appreciated Michelle's skill and what a great contribution she's made to our committee. Excellent questions. She's worked tirelessly on legislation, giving input on our reports, and she's meant so much to us as a friend and colleague, and we will miss her greatly, but our country is better off because of her service. And with that, turn it over to Dusty Jones.
2 years ago, Speaker McCarthy and Leader Jeffries promised us that they would populate the committee with the best of the House, the most serious legislators who understood that this was not to be a partisan food fight. And boy, Mr. Chairman, they hit the mark with Michelle Steele. No one does homework like Michelle does. Nobody works like she does. We are better because of her efforts, and we just want to say thank you. And before we start talking about some of the hard work you've had a hand in, I'd ask for a round of applause for Mrs. Steele.
I'm going to cry.
Very good. Thank you, John. Thank you, Dustin. Thank you, Michelle. Well, let me kick off with a few remarks, and then I'll turn it over to some of the other members of the committee. This has been a bipartisan effort. It's brought together leaders from government, from law enforcement, from certainly critical sectors to address one of the gravest threats that we face, that our American families face, and that is the fentanyl epidemic. It truly is a crisis proportions. And today, we're very proud to be able to take the next step in this effort by introducing and making public legislation that implements many of the committee's most pressing recommendations in our fentanyl report that was released last spring. These bills that we're about to talk about reflect the dedication of this group, which has worked tirelessly to identify real, actionable solutions by consulting experts in intelligence, law enforcement, as well as international trade. I certainly want to recognize members of the working group and their staffs, as well as staff on the Select Committee itself, for their constructive input and their commitment to hold the People's Republic of China accountable for their role in this crisis. I particularly want to thank my good friend from the state of Massachusetts and my fellow co-lead, Mr. Auchincloss. Thank you, sir. And I will turn to him in just a moment, and then we will hear from the committee chairman, Molinar, as well as ranking member, Krishnamurthy. Each member of this working group will then have an opportunity to share their thoughts and their experiences. But first, let me take just a minute to discuss the legislation, which is, I'm proud to say, is bipartisan, that we are endorsing today. You know, the fentanyl epidemic has devastated our nation. When we say that this crisis knows no boundaries, it is absolutely true. It affects every community in our country, every family, every corner of America. It doesn't matter if you live in an urban area or a rural setting. And while fentanyl itself is the immediate threat, we have to also address China's central role in subsidizing, in producing, and exporting the precursors that have fueled this epidemic. For far too long, China has profited from the destruction of American lives. The legislation that we are endorsing today is a direct response to this outrage, and I am pleased to announce the introduction of 3 bipartisan bills. Number 1, the Joint Task Force to Counter Illicit Synthetic Narcotics Act. This act establishes a federal task force to coordinate efforts across agencies to disrupt fentanyl trafficking networks, enforce sanctions, and hold bad actors accountable. This is about streamlining operations and delivering real results. Number two, the CCP Fentanyl Sanctions Act. It codifies and builds on Executive Order 14059 and targets the financial networks of fentanyl producers by cutting off their access to the U.S. banking system. It closes loopholes and ensures that those fueling this crisis are truly held accountable. And then thirdly, the International Protection from PRC Fentanyl Act, which imposes penalties on PRC ports, on vessels, and on exporters that fail to meet clear thresholds for transparency and manifesting cargo. By enforcing compliance and levying fines, it funds U.S. anti-trafficking efforts and sends a clear message to the CCP. This fight transcends politics because it's about protecting American people. These bills, which will be filed later today, are not just policy recommendations. I see them as truly a call to action. So we look forward to working with the chairman and with the ranking member, certainly with relevant authorizing committees and appropriating committees, and all of our colleagues to expeditiously pass this legislation in the 119th Congress. We are committed to do everything in our power to end this epidemic. So now I'd like to invite Representative Auchincloss, my worthy comrade. It sounds a little too partner in this working group for any opening remarks that you'd care to make. Jake, the floor is yours.
Thank you to Dan for your partnership and leadership on this issue. It's really been a pleasure to work with you and your staff. And I want to thank the staff on both sides as well on the fentanyl working group. Really professional, competent, responsive, and committed to this critical issue. I want to thank our ranking member and our chair of the China Select Committee. This kind of work is exactly what the China Select Committee was formed to do. Bipartisan work focused at the intersection of U.S.-China competition with the well-being of the American people and done in a way that's not performative, but is rather substantive. And so I appreciate you two giving the time and space for this to unfold in the way that it has. When the Select Committee released the fentanyl report upon which this legislation is based, a mother from my district, Deb Schmill, traveled to Washington for the hearing. She's the mother of Becca, a young, vibrant girl whose life was taken on September 16th, 2020 from fentanyl poisoning. And as with all of my fellow members here, we have tens of thousands of stories like that in our districts. I visited an exhibit at a college in my district a couple months ago where I looked at the photographs and read some of the vignettes of young men and women whose brains were hijacked by the most addictive chemical known to humanity and who died. And sometimes the best their parents and loved ones could do in their final hours was just to make them know that they were loved as the addiction took over. We have to fight this. This is state-sponsored poisoning of the American people, costing 100,000 American lives every single year. And the genesis of this is squarely on the mainland of the People's Republic of China, where the chemical manufacturers are being subsidized and facilitated in the export of fentanyl precursors to American shores, oftentimes working with, by, and through the drug cartels. And these three pieces of bipartisan legislation are significant steps for interdicting and disrupting the fentanyl supply chain. My bill will codify President Biden's executive order that targets the Achilles heel of fentanyl and related synthetic narcotics producers, which is their exposure to the U.S. banking system. Executive Order 14095 established new sanctions authorities against actors involved in fentanyl trafficking, and my bill would codify and strengthen these authorizations to ensure that the traffickers can be held accountable for their actions and the devastation they inflict on our communities. Both strengthens and codifies this important issue. And I'm also proud to co-lead the other products of our task force, which we'll hear about from our colleagues today. This is a good day for the opioid epidemic and the fentanyl scourge in this country because we are making bipartisan progress in Congress. And now let's pass these bills into law.
Thank you very much, Mr. Auchincloss. Appreciate those comments, and thanks for helping to make it personal, because it truly is personal to each and every one of us. We all have stories that just related. Now I'd like to turn to the chairman of the full committee, Chairman Newhouse.
Well, thank you very much. You know, this is a season of joy for Americans. However, for all too many families, their joy will soon be overshadowed by empty seats at the Christmas table. Missing fathers, mothers, sons, daughters, uncles, and nephews taken from their loved ones by a silent killer. On average, over 200 Americans die from fentanyl daily. Imagine a passenger plane carrying over 200 people crashing and killing everyone on board. That is what is happening every day in America's fentanyl crisis. Over 97% of fentanyl precursors are produced in the People's Republic of China with the complicity and support of the Chinese Communist Party. The CCP directly subsidizes the mass production and export of fentanyl and its precursors that are illegal to produce in China. Some of these companies are even owned by the CCP. While the CCP uses its oppressive surveillance state to stop domestic drug trafficking, it does less than nothing to monitor, censor, or prevent the export of drugs out of China. When presented with evidence of Chinese companies breaking Chinese law and killing Americans, the government has tipped off the criminals to help them evade action by the U.S. rather than prosecuting their criminal activity. This is all part of the CCP's playbook on asymmetric warfare, encouraging and turning a blind eye toward the criminal activity so long as that activity harms Americans. This cannot continue. And under the leadership of our co-leads, Dan Newhouse and Jake Auchincloss, this policy working group has developed bipartisan solutions that will help us beat back the tide of CCP fentanyl that is murdering Americans. I fully endorse the 3 bills they introduced earlier, and I look forward to seeing those bills become law next year. We must ensure that the CCP can no longer profit from flooding America with illegal fentanyl. And the individuals and entities complicit in this atrocity face the full consequences of the law. We owe that to the countless victims of this CCP-fueled epidemic and to future generations of Americans. Thank you to Congressman Newhouse and Auchincloss, the ranking member, and all of the fentanyl group's working group's members for this package of bipartisan legislation and the tireless work they've put into this policy working group.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate those remarks. Now let me turn to our ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Christopher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Chairman Wilmer. Thank you, Chair, Ranking Member Auchincloss. You guys did just a terrific job on this working group, and thank you to all the members of the working group as well for rolling up your sleeves and trying to do the hard work of legislating in a bipartisan fashion. It's not easy around here, but you decided to figure out what are the boldest common denominators that unify our approach, and then build around that 3 bills that I think we should actually try to pass into law. And I think we should do so with a lot of energy, and we should bring it to the Trump administration's attention at the earliest and make sure that they understand this is a unified approach. I think the approach centers on the fact that we know that the Chinese Communist Party is not only aware that they export 97% of illicit precursor chemicals that the rest of the world is hurting from in the production of fentanyl. They subsidize the production. They turn a blind eye to the prosecution of perpetrators of this illicit trade, and now we're going to act. And I just have one visual, since John Willner asked me to bring one today, that sums it all for me, which is simply this. In 2022, the U.S. suffered 76,000 fentanyl poisoning deaths. And this is the number of fentanyl poisoning deaths China reports, 0. It may not be 0, but the fact is that it's a lot less than 76,000. They know how to enforce their own laws inside their country. But when it comes time to enforcing these laws with regard to the export of these products, they don't care, or worse. And that's why we convene this working group, and that's why you folks have come up with the different pieces of legislation that we're talking about today. The Joint Task Force is an excellent concept, and I think that it's going to really help to inform what we need to do going forward. And also, it's going to create safeguards so that we don't necessarily target vulnerable communities in America suffering from addiction. The CCP Fentanyl Sanctions Act, which codifies President Biden's executive order, is another excellent piece of legislation. I'm so glad that we're kind of rallying around this. And then the third piece of legislation, which requires Chinese ships basically to impose standards which the rest of our companies in the United States have to live by, is very reasonable. Know your customer. You can't deliver cargo to the United States containing fentanyl. It's just that simple. And so these particular pieces of legislation would resonate from Illinois, Massachusetts, and even South Dakota. And so I think that we should do everything in our power to make them law, and I can't wait to see how we take next steps in as constructive and bipartisan fashion. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Christian. Appreciate very much, Mr. Wade. It's going to be a meeting without. At this point, I'd like to welcome other members of the working group to make any comments that they would like to, share some of their views on the legislation and their experience.
For me, the most chilling moment of our work is when a former senior leader at the DEA told us that our country does not have a fentanyl problem, we have a China problem. Entirely within the ability of the Chinese party to stop this state-sponsored poisoning. They choose not to because, as some of my colleagues have mentioned, this is asymmetrical warfare. And we should all have sadness over the carnage of 76,000 Americans poisoned. That's sadness enough, but I have additional sadness that we haven't acted before now. I think we have viewed this as a drug problem, part of rather than combat with an adversary that is poisoning us. These bills are all three strong. I would tell you I am most excited about the International Protection from PRC Fentanyl Act because we are actually beginning to impose serious sanctions, fines on the vessels, on the ports, on the exporters that do not do their job. And if you are going to be an accessory to the poisoning of America, then you are going to have to pay for it in hard dollars and cents, with fines that will escalate, with fines that will double. And so often in this town, we end up passing bills that sound good, but they're either political theater and they're not actually a lawmaking exercise, or they don't really do anything. Even if they become law, they don't bend the trajectory of this country. I have to tell you, when the supply chain of sometimes legitimate actors are having to write serious checks because of their recklessness, they will change their behavior and American lives will be saved. I'm not sure there's anything that we're going to do in the next few months in Congress that's going to be a heck of a lot more important than that. I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. And just to make, unless you could correct me, that number of 76,000 is per year. Not just total since 2020. So that's, Ms. Steele, turn the floor to you.
I want to say thank you to all the members and thank you for being on this subcommittee. And you know what? Something can be done before I leave. So I'm so grateful for that. California gets the most precursor fentanyl coming from China, and then it goes down to Mexico, and then the border, through California border, it's coming in. California affects the most of that fentanyl because it's coming directly from Mexico. And you know what? What we are doing is the right thing, and this is the right direction. And I was so lucky that when I was named to get, joining your committee, Select Committee on China, plus on this subcommittee, because this is the most important part for our future in the United States. I do whatever I can as a average citizen from now on, from next year. But you know what? Love to get involved with the Select Committee on China, and I learned so much about it, and especially on other committees that I've been on, AI Task Force, for the cyber attacks, and actually Ways and Means Committee for trade issues, everything actually related to China. We really have to stop China's aggression and China's attack. And I think you have a really big job next year that how are we going to stop China? And I know you all going to do it, and I'm going to rooting on it. So thank you so much for inviting me.
Mr. Chairman, I hate to disagree with the gentlelady. She may well be a citizen in January, but she will not be average in any way.
So noted, Mr. Johnson. Thank you very much for your comments, and I just want to say thanks again to all the members of the working group and all the members of the entire select committee as well for their hard work on what is such a critical issue in our country, and certainly for your support for the legislation that we are making public today. And I gotta say, just an observation type comment, as you saw here today, it's very difficult to distinguish that partisan line on this committee. It's been a very bipartisan effort. It's an interesting phenomena when we face a crisis as Americans. The partisanship seems to fade away, and I think we've certainly demonstrated that on this committee. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all the members for making that a reality. So, and the bills that we're presenting today along those lines are supported by every member of the committee. It's very notable. So while this wraps up the work of the working group, we certainly are not done, and we are fully aware that there's much more work to do in the 119th Congress. And I look forward to continuing to work with my colleagues on this committee in the next Congress so that we not only can make these bills become law, but continue our efforts to safeguard our nation from what truly has become one of the most serious crises that we have ever faced. And so with that, a few of us, I think, are able to stay for some questions if there are any from those who are here. And I appreciate very much your attention to this important issue. With that, I'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you.
Pleasure to work with you.
Thank you.